The world is warming, and we are the cause. When I lived with a climate scientist, sometimes I was the first to find out the truth. Day after day, she would come home with graphs and data, diagrams and projections. Each one told the story of a future we hoped never to face. One day I'll never forget, in spring 2014, Bethany pushed through the front door, clutching papers that held the ultimate news. So keen, she rushed to join me in the living room, but could not sit. Instead, she paced in front of my chair and talked, unable to even take off her coat. "It's now 95%, she began, and I knew what she meant, but I let her explain it anyway. This was what we'd been waiting for. 95% is as certain as scientists get. I watched her walk back and forth in front of me like a pendulum. It means we can finally say what we've been wanting to. This. It's extremely likely that climate change is human influenced. Look, I have to write it in this month's report. It'll go to all the newspapers. It will be the first time we've actually said it. We are destroying the planet." And we both knew what this meant. Undeniable certainty that humans are causing climate change would end the so-called debate. A green light for global change. And I expected headlines. Scientists announce certainty. Every newspaper. Instead, the press covered the report, but somehow missed this huge and important piece. So what's gone wrong with how we talk about climate change? 5 years on, what Bethany wrote is not household knowledge. Everyone remembers where they were when the Twin Towers fell. No one except me remembers where they were the day it was confirmed that humans are the dominant cause of the world warming. Until we know, we cannot act. So let's start talking about it. Let's spread the word. Let's make climate change something we talk about for a change. What if we all became heroes? When I lived with a climate scientist, she read superhero comics on the weekends and absorbed disaster movies at the rate most zombies get through human flesh. And I thought it funny at first. Asked Bethany about it one evening as she cooked spaghetti bolognese with The Walking Dead blaring in the background on TV. Her simple answer? I find it comforting. It made sense then. Day after day, studying the likelihood of a catastrophic future, exploring climate projections and so on, Bethany needed to come home to stories of superheroes and human heroes, of survival against the odds. Indeed, the odds are against us more and more every day. If our rate of greenhouse gas emissions doesn't reduce, by 2070, much of the UK will experience summers more than 5 degrees warmer than they are now. Meanwhile, the global 2-degree target drifts further and further from being attainable. Like Bethany, so many of us love to watch films about saving the world, to immerse ourselves in the magic of a planet on the brink of disaster, brought back from the edge by the superpowers of bona fide heroes, or the bravery and single-mindedness of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. To me, Bethany was a superhero, devoting her special abilities to serving the human race. But what would it take for us all to become the ordinary heroes, just like in all those films, coming together, bringing all our bravery and determination to the task of making sure we as a planet survive? Is this storm because of climate change? When I lived with a climate scientist, one day I watched our street flood while she sat at her desk writing an article on extreme weather. And that was the day it sank in. This is really happening. Our 2 cats retreated indoors, shaking off their fur and damply slinking away to separate corners to groom themselves dry. Are you writing that today's storm is because of climate change? I asked, as our landlord appeared at the window, beckoning me to move my van before the water covered its wheels. It doesn't work like that, Bethany explained. That's a bad enough mistake to start again.
Sorry, I feel that was because I jerked.
Rolling?
Yep, still
Okay.
rolling.
Is this storm because of climate change? When I lived with a climate scientist, one day I watched our street flood while she sat at her desk writing an article on extreme weather. That was the day it sank in. This is really happening. Our 2 cats retreated indoors, shaking off their fur and damply slinking away to separate corners to groom themselves dry. Are you writing that today's storm is because of climate change? I asked, as our landlord appeared at the window, beckoning me to move my van before the water covers its wheels. It doesn't work like that, Bethany explained, as I pulled on my wellies and raincoat. You can't say a specific storm is caused by climate change. What happens is that extreme weather, like this flood, becomes more likely because of climate change, and more frequent. I opened the door and prepared myself to step out into the onslaught of raindrops, huge as giants' tears. So, you're saying that it's hard to measure exactly how much by, but we can be sure that this is part of climate change taking effect, this pouring rain? Bethany nodded. But as a scientist, I have to say, likely. I go to move my van, and I'm almost too late. Every other car on our street has already left. I turn the ignition cautiously, drive to higher ground slowly and steadily before wading back home. What sank in for me that day was that climate change is not something far off in the distant future. It's happening now. It's probably a little part of every storm. And I wonder how much we'll have to adapt, or if we can, or what happens when it's not just a case of driving further up a hill. As climate scientist Kate Marvel writes on her blog, we are sending our children to an unfamiliar planet. Getting the message out. When I lived with a climate scientist, I stopped wondering if the world is warming. It is. There was no more need to decode contradicting news headlines or wade through scientific papers that filled my head with words I didn't understand. I could finally get the truth from the horse's mouth, brought home fresh every day. Bethany taught me how 95% meant extremely likely, meaning the world is warming because of us. Why do you always say extremely likely? I asked one night as we sat and shared a drink. Why not definite? Aren't you sure? Oh, we're sure. We know the world is warming. We do. There is no debate. It's extremely likely that humans are the dominant cause. In the language of science, no one ever says definite. We have to say extremely likely. It's just the language of science. But isn't this why the message isn't getting through? She looked up at me puzzled, and so I went on. 95% certain makes it sound like there's still something left to prove, like we can't be sure. But 95% is as close to certain as scientists can realistically ever get. Bethany paused, turned her drink over in her hand, then turned her gaze out the window to the night sky. If someone said they were 95% certain your plane was going to crash, would you get on it? After that conversation, Bethany set herself to communicating climate science, to getting the message out. No more time could be wasted on the myth of the climate debate. Soon she made climate communication her mission, writing complex science in the plainest English that she could. And at home, all those nights we sat up watching the lights of planes flying low in the sky, Bethany taught me how to talk about climate change, and most importantly, that we must. The most important question. When I lived with a climate scientist, I made her a survival kit for the end of the world, just in case. One night, Bethany and I had stayed up late discussing what we might take with us, and then I packed it all into a rucksack as a surprise for her birthday. It made her laugh, partly because it was a joke, and partly because it was light relief against the harsh reality of her work as a climatologist. "No clothes," she remarked as she rummaged through the army surplus backpack. "We agreed no clothes," I said plainly. No point smelling freshly laundered at the cost of bringing enough drinking water or this all-important Swiss Army knife. "I could have bought one pair of pants instead of that knife," she smiled. "Yes, but how would you open these tins?" I countered, pulling out tuna and beans. Bethany picked one up, threw it in the air and caught it lazily with one hand. "You reckon the super rich have got whole underground bunkers planned?" Her face turned serious. "They will if they've been paying attention like we have." At times like that, living with Bethany felt like living in reality. The outside world was just a bad dream where everyone acted like climate change wasn't happening, wasn't an emergency. Every single day we talked about the world warming, about what it might mean in our lifetimes and beyond. Knowing the science as we did, it was baffling not to see it on headline news every night. Sometimes we joked, packed another mock bag of tins to help us cope. But mainly, we brainstormed ways in which the world could change, drew maps of the globe, and asked each other how humans could live on it sustainably. The most important question was always this: what would work? And the most important thing was that we kept asking it. Oracle syndrome. When I lived with a climate scientist, she took me to the pub to meet with a friend and colleague, and we sat in armchairs on a quiet evening in a corner with a floor lamp. Bethany was a small, dark-haired, serious woman in a sharp suit, and her friend Paul was a balding yet personable man in a flowery shirt, top button undone. "How much longer do you think you'll last?" he asked, rattling the ice in his gin and tonic and leaning back in his chair. Bethany laughed, not in amusement, but surprise. "You too?" she asked. "You're wondering about jacking it in, but can't because it's too important?" "Oh no," her friend said lightly. "I'm happy just to give it up. Nothing we can do, no one listens. We may as well stop now and have a nice life. I think I'll quit and become a cleaner. I've more chance of cleaning a sink than of getting the whole planet to clean up their emissions." And Bethany really did laugh then. In amusement, you could say, but it was a painful sound, echoing against the truth that the world has warmed by 0.85 degrees since 1880. The world has seen almost 2 lifetimes worth of human-influenced global warming, and over half a lifetime of climate research, and still what Julius Lingo describes as the human issue has been, relatively speaking, ignored. "What would you do if you quit being a climatologist?" Paul asked next. "I'd write a play about us, call it Oracle syndrome." Bethany's answer rolled straight off her tongue, and she spoke without looking up from her drink. "Oracle syndrome," he echoed thoughtfully. "That's a good name for it." It would be about a climate scientist named Cassandra, who said the world is warming and who wasn't believed. The point is to feel it. When I lived with a climate scientist, she took me to a night of creative responses to climate change. In a striking white jacket and smart shirt, Bethany walked confidently to the podium after being introduced as a climate scientist by day and award-winning writer by night, who obviously could not be a more perfect guide for this evening's event. There is nothing that heartens me more than to see science well represented in art, she began. Tonight is a response to climate change, and the point is to feel it. What is the difference between cold, clerical, scientific language and the language that we share as humans? A good place to start, of course, is science, and it plays a major part, as does art. That evening, I saw such a range of powerful pieces, each one from an award-winning artist in their own right. None of this is about the individual, Bethany went on to say. Climate change is a collective issue for all humans. And beyond that, because this is not just a human world, it's an entire ecosystem. It's not iPhones, it's not tablets, it's not Facebook, it's the world. It was then I understood that if we are to face something as huge as the future of the planet, we need science to feed our actions, and art to help us feel so that we can act. More importantly, the point is to feel it together so that we can act together.